right?
We can hear
Yeah.
you. Thank you.
So, yes, okay. Um, my paper, I want to have a prescript and a postscript to bracket the paper. And the paper itself, I'm not going to talk too much about. Um, I first met Roger in, well, 50 years ago, almost 50 years ago in 1970. I had come from Vancouver on the west coast of Canada and had been assigned to be a doctoral student supervised by someone called R.S. Schofield. And I knew that I'd seen the name somewhere, but it was a pre-internet age, and his article in the Economic History Review was a number of years old. There was no way of searching for it. So I wasn't sure who this person was. I, of course, had heard of Wrigley and I'd heard of Laslett, but this Schofield guy, I wasn't sure who he was. So in September 1970, when my wife and I arrived in Cambridge, after a couple of days of getting over jet lag, I realized, that I had to go and meet this man at Silver Street. So I walked from Churchill College, where we were living. It's a beautiful day, early autumn day, warm, sunny, perfect. And I got to the Queen's Bridge. I came over the Queen's Bridge. I looked, there were street numbers. There was number 24, 22, and then 18, which was the Penguin Bookstore. I went back, I did it again. And then I realized there was a little passageway. And there on the door of the passageway, it was noted that there was an office for the classics department and another one for the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure. So I went in the door and was met by the secretary from the classics department and explained who I was. And she says, "Oh, that lot, go up the stairs." Very welcoming. I then came up the stairs and introduced myself, I believe, if memory serves, to Sylvia Jacobs, and told her that I was a member of the Cambridge Group. And she looked at me with a raised Spockian eyebrow and said, "Really?" Not realizing the gradations that existed. Anyhow, that got resolved and I was told to go upstairs. And if any of you had been in that building, it was almost a warren of small rooms. I went upstairs, I knocked on the door, and there was Roger Schofield. The man actually existed. I told him who I was, and he looked at me somewhat dumbfounded because, of course, he'd been assigned to me and completely forgotten about it, which was perfectly reasonable since it'd been 4 months and he'd had other things to do. We had a chat. I explained who I was. I explained what I wanted to do. I explained the subject I wanted to do, and he nodded and was very welcoming. And we talked for about 40 minutes. Then it was time for morning coffee. We went downstairs and we entered another small room, and there was Richard Wall, Carla Oosterveen, Ros Davies, Sylvia Jacobs. And then this man enters in a purple suit, and it's Peter Laslett. Well, this seemed to be quite exciting. What happened afterwards was much more exciting. Some chit-chat. Then Roger says, impishly, to Peter, "Peter, I know that you fancy yourself to be a sociologist. So I'm wondering what you made of the pairings last night on Come Dancing." And I had no idea what they were talking about. And Roger then next said, I couldn't quite stop myself wondering what a sociologist like you would make of that couple from the north, the bank teller from Newcastle, and the miner from Gateshead. How would a sociologist explain that pairing? And Peter, of course, said, well, chaps, I've just got back from Paris, and proceeded to blather away, as he was wont to do. So that was my introduction. In the next several years, I was engaged in reconstituting two communities, Shepshed and Bodisford in Leicestershire, which were chosen because they represented what I thought were two different polarities in 18th century demographic history. In the following years with Keith Wrightson, I engaged in two further studies, and we looked at a community called Tarling in Essex, and also a place called Wickham in County Durham, which had been at the center of the early coal mining industry. And I had done, by that time, in the late 1980s, 4 family reconstitutions. And there was no way on God's earth I was going to do a 5th. That was enough. In any event, I had been invited, along with David Weir, to take part in the Social Science History Association's meeting that was held in Washington in 1988. And Weir was given the job of talking optimistically about the future of parish register demography. And my job was to be the opposite person and to talk pessimistically, which accounts for the title of the paper that I submitted. We got to I think it was the Shoreham Hotel, and they'd given us a very small room. And when we got into the room, it was full, which was wonderful, except there was only about 15 people there, because as I said, it was a very small room. After we just got started, and what seemed like a very elderly man, tall, thin, with graying hair, and thinning hair too, came into the room, looked around, couldn't find anywhere any free seats, so he sat on the floor, just like a graduate student. And then I realized this was going to be the high point of my academic career, because I was able to tell the crowd, well, the group, this was a fantastic moment for me. Lawrence Stone was sitting at my feet. Now, I'd known Lawrence for about 10 years at that point in time, and he was quite happy to be joshed, to be ribbed, and in fact, he actually blushed. So the paper looked at what I thought was the heroic developments in historical demography, which were very straightforwardly, in a way, indicated but substantiated Hanau's thesis on late marriage, and to a lesser extent, in a more confusing manner, what Louis Henry had to say about natural fertility. Natural fertility seemed to be whatever you found, as far as Henry was concerned. And the paper that I've delivered, as I said, was written in 1988. And I sent it to Elid, and it's going to be, I hope, published unchanged. I had thought that I'd lost it, but it turned out that one of my former students had a copy. And so that's its, in a sense, its provenance, to quote the antiquities world. Now, for digression, to get to the main point of what I think is what I have to say here. Years later, I met Jacques Dupaquier, who was Henri's successor at INED. And he would be invited to a meeting, a historical demographic meeting in Canada. And Canada is officially a bilingual country. So Henri and I spoke in French, which of course was easier for him than, I should say Dupaquier and I spoke in French, which was easier for him than it was for me. So I asked him the kind of rudimentary question one would put to someone you hardly knew, but knew by reputation. What's the recent work that's taking place in Paris with your research equipe. And he told me that they were interested in historical biology, and I had no idea what he was talking about. So he explained to me that one of the things that they know and have learned is that of the population alive in 1789, only 15% had direct descendants alive in the 1980s. And then he looked at me and he said, but of course you're Canadian, so you know that there are an enormous number of people in Canada called Tremblay. And they are descended from one person who came to Canada in the 1630s. And I said, but this is a more confusing issue because one presumes that it was not only the genetic inheritance of Monsieur Tremblay, but also Madame Tremblay that was at work. And indeed, that had sort of been an issue that circulated, bounced around in my head. And in 2008-ish, I'm not sure of the exact date, I had written a paper and with a graduate student of ours called Julie Savoie, and we had looked at the peculiar nature of the fertility transition in Quebec in the mid 20th century. It's a very fraught subject. French Canada was reputed to have much higher fertility than the rest of Canada, but in fact, it turned out that that was a statistical artifact. The reality was that more than half of all children were born into very large families, what one might call surfecondité. And there were a great many examples of this. The chanteuse Céline Dion is one of 15 children. Our former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien was one of 13 siblings. This was very characteristic of Quebec, and it was a change that occurred dramatically, radically, and quickly. And it confounded the various nationalist and I guess you could say religious explanations, because it seemingly had nothing to do with Le Revanche de Berceau, the Revenge of the Cradle, or French Canadian nationalism in any way, shape, or form. Moreover, and more interestingly, the practice, the existence of surfecondité wasn't just a matter of the Tremblays. It was also a matter, as I mentioned, of Céline Dion and Jean Chrétien, or hockey stars like Maurice the Rocket Richard or Marcel Dion, who was one of 15, who had retired before his brother even began to lace up skates in the National Hockey League, or the historical demographer Gerard Bouchard. This was a dramatic characteristic of Quebec society. But even more dramatic was the experience of friends of mine that absolutely encapsulated the problem. Quebec today has among what they call the Purlain or Vraie Souche, the French Canadian generation after generation population who have been added to by migration from the famine, from Ireland, and now from La Francophonie in Haiti and other parts of, particularly from Africa, North Africa. These friends of mine, Michel was one of 15 children. He was the second youngest. His oldest sister was 29 years older than him. His wife, Natalie, was born in Burgundy. She was one of 5 children, which is exceptionally large family in contemporary France. Together, they had 1 child. This encapsulated in one couple's experience this dramatic change that occurred within Quebec society in the late 20th century. Sadly, Roger wasn't there for that meeting. But that meeting was interesting to me, and it drew up one of the things that I talked about in my paper and that I had worked on in 1978 and led to papers that were published a couple of years later about the history of literacy. And when I'd gone to Princeton, which is where I met Lawrence Stone, I'd taken along the family reconstitution forms for Shepshed with me. And I decided that what I wanted to do was to use the notation in the top corner of those forms of literacy, whether someone could sign or not sign, and make that the independent variable, and then reconstitute the populations according to whether or not they were literate as defined. And what I found was that the transmission of literacy between generations was very haphazard, and between siblings was very haphazard, that it completely confounded the optimistic view of literacy that was put forward by people like Stone, who thought that literacy was a key index of modernization. And it seems to me that this question of inter and intrafamilial and generational study was one that could be very fruitfully researched. And we've heard, particularly from Rosemary Ledbetter's presentation, that indeed one can look at these factors to greatly illuminate the micro level experience of these broad historical processes, which too frequently are treated just in aggregated terms. And it raises a great many questions about what more could be done with that vast tranche of information that exists in the Campop archive of 27 or 28 or ever how many reconstitutions there are, to look at questions of intergenerational or intra-sibling behavior, to give a stronger position to demography and family history, rather than seeing it simply as the dependent variable, the response to economic and social change. And while I'm not and never will be the person to do it, I think that it's gratifying to see that these kinds of challenges, this kind of challenge, has been taken up. And I'm hopeful that in the future, more people will do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much too, David. And again, claps from everybody. Thank you. We'll move on to live